I spend my days repairing things that most people consider ruined beyond salvation. I am a high-end book restorer and letterpress artisan. My studio, located on the ground floor of a historic townhouse in Providence, is filled with the scent of old paper, binding glue, and aging leather. People bring me water-damaged journals from the 19th century, torn family Bibles, and rare first editions with their spines completely shattered. I sit under a warm yellow lamp for hours, meticulously stitching pages back together, smoothing out creases, and breathing life back into forgotten histories. I have infinite patience for broken things, but what took me entirely too long to realize is that you can only fix something if it actually wants to be whole. You cannot stitch a family back together when the people in it are actively tearing it apart for sport. My name is Kinsley Carter. I am 34 years old. If you're listening from somewhere far away, drop your city in the comments so I can see how far this has traveled. And please stay with me until the end, because the story I'm about to tell you is not just about a ruined holiday. It is about the deeply hidden, toxic financial dynamics that can rot a family from the inside out, and the terrifying, liberating moment when you finally decide to stop being the designated shock absorber for everyone else's dysfunction. I am a single mother to two incredible children, Liam, who is 10, and Harper, who is 6. After my divorce a few years ago, I made a conscious choice to live a very quiet, grounded life. My ex-husband and I had a fair, equitable split, and I walked away with a solid financial foundation. Combine that with the fact that my restoration business actually caters to elite private collectors, museums, and high-end auction houses where a single restoration project can bring in thousands of dollars. I was quietly thriving. I had no mortgage on my townhouse. I had robust savings. I lived entirely debt-free. But you would never know it by looking at me. I practice what you might call stealth wealth. I drive a 10-year-old Volvo because it's safe and reliable. I wear comfortable, paint-stained jeans and oversized sweaters when I work. I don't buy flashy designer bags, and I don't post my bank balances on social media. I pour my resources into my children's education and my own peace of mind. But in my family, if you aren't showing off, you must be failing. And my family desperately needed me to be failing. My father, Trevor, is a man who demands to be the center of the universe. He is a retired boomer who spent his prime years as a mid-level manager, barking orders and feeling important. Now, with his health declining and his pension swallowed by inflation and poor financial choices, his ego is the only thing he has left. He needs to feel like the powerful patriarch, the savior, the man in charge. My mother, Melissa, is the ultimate covert enabler. She has spent her entire adult life playing the victim, using weaponized incompetence and fragile size to manipulate everyone around her. She would rather sacrifice her own children on the altar of my father's pride than face an uncomfortable truth or rock the boat. And then there is Bexley, my younger sister, the golden child. Bexley is a walking Instagram filter. She is married to a genuinely decent guy named Harrison, and together they project the image of a wealthy, thriving, perfect young couple. They lease luxury cars, take ski trips to Aspen, and wear clothes with logos so big they look like walking billboards. To Trevor, Melissa, and Bexley, I was the perfect scapegoat. I was the struggling single mom artist. It was a narrative that served them beautifully. It made Trevor feel superior. It gave Melissa something to dramatically sigh about to her friends at church. And it made Bexley feel like the undeniable winner of the sibling rivalry. What the rest of the world didn't know was that behind closed doors, I was the one keeping them afloat. Whenever Trevor had an unexpected medical bill or needed a major car repair, Melissa would call me in tears. "We just don't know what we're going to do," she would sob, her voice trembling with practiced fragility. "Your father is so proud. He would die if he knew I was asking." So I would quietly transfer $3,000 to her account. Whenever Bexley maxed out her lifestyle, she would call me in a panic, claiming Harrison had a temporary setback with his job and they were going to miss their mortgage payment. "Just a temporary loan," she would promise. "Don't tell Mom and Dad, they'll worry." I would wire her $2,000. I paid Melissa's property taxes when they fell short. I covered dental bills. I paid for the new furnace when theirs broke down in the dead of winter. Over the span of 3 years, I had quietly funneled tens of thousands of dollars into their lives. But they never acknowledged it as help. In their twisted reality, accepting money from me caused cognitive dissonance. To protect their egos, they had to reframe the narrative. So they decided that I was a chaotic mess and the money I gave them was just a happy accident, while the tiny, insignificant favors they did for me were monumental acts of charity. If Trevor came over to replace a $20 leaky faucet in my kitchen, he acted as if he had built my house with his bare hands. If Melissa watched my kids for 2 hours so I could attend a client meeting, she would complain about her back aching for weeks, ensuring everyone knew the heavy burden of my chaotic single mother life. I let them believe their own lies. I swallowed my pride, kept my mouth shut, and kept transferring the money, thinking that this was simply the price of admission to have a family. I thought I was protecting the peace. I didn't realize I was funding my own abuse. It all came to a head on Christmas Eve. Melissa had insisted on having Christmas dinner at my house. She claimed my historic townhouse had a quaint Dickensian charm, which was her passive-aggressive way of saying it looked old and small. In reality, she insisted on coming to my place so she wouldn't have to cook or clean, but could still play the role of the exhausted hostess giving directions from the armchair. I spent 3 days preparing. I roasted a prime rib, baked 3 types of pies from scratch, and decorated the house until it looked like a glowing, warm sanctuary. I wanted Liam and Harper to have a magical, safe holiday. They arrived like a slow-moving storm. Melissa walked in first, brushing imaginary dust off her coat, immediately readjusting the wreath I had hung on the front door. "It was just a little off-center, honey," she murmured, patting my cheek. Trevor came in next, stomping the snow off his boots with unnecessary force. He looked around the lively, bustling living room where my kids were playing softly with their new toys, and his face immediately hardened. Joy, that didn't revolve around him, always felt like a personal insult to my father. "Is it always this loud in here?" he grumbled, taking off his coat and tossing it over the banister instead of hanging it up. Bexley and Harrison arrived last. Bexley swept in wearing a designer cashmere coat, her arms full of expensive, elaborately wrapped gifts that I instantly knew she had put on a high-interest credit card. Harrison smiled warmly at me, carrying a bottle of nice wine, completely oblivious to the financial house of cards his wife was building behind his back. The tension in the house escalated with every hour. Everything I did was met with a microaggression. When I served the appetizers, Trevor loudly joked to Harrison, "Better eat up, who knows if the main course is actually cooked. You know how easily distracted she gets." When Harper, my sweet 6-year-old, ran up to show Melissa a drawing she had made, Melissa gave it a cursory glance and said, "That's nice, dear, but please don't get marker on Grandma's silk blouse." I bit my tongue. I poured more wine. I kept my head down, focusing on carving the meat and serving the plates. I told myself what I always told myself, just get through the dessert, just let them have this, be the bigger person. We sat down at the large oak dining table. Trevor had automatically taken the head of the table, in my house, presiding over the meal like a king holding court. The kids were sitting quietly, picking at their mashed potatoes, sensing the heavy, suffocating atmosphere that adults try and fail to hide. Halfway through the meal, it happened. Trevor set his fork down heavily against his porcelain plate. The sharp clink made the entire room freeze. He reached for his wine glass, holding it up by the stem. "I have an announcement to make," he said, his voice booming, carrying that specific tone of artificial authority he loved so much. Melissa looked down at her lap, her face perfectly composed into an expression of long-suffering martyrdom. Bexley leaned forward, a tiny, eager smirk playing on the corner of her lips. Harrison looked confused. Liam and Harper stopped eating, their wide eyes darting between their grandfather and me. "Since some people in this family," Trevor began, looking directly across the table at me, his eyes cold and hard, "seem to think that we are a free service, your mother and I have made a decision." My stomach dropped. The air in the room suddenly felt incredibly thin. Trevor raised his voice, ensuring that every word echoed off the antique walls of my home. "We are done. We are done being your free babysitters. We are done being your handymen. We are done bailing you out of every little mess you create because you can't seem to manage your own life." He paused, letting the cruelty hang in the air, soaking into the walls. "You've leaned on us for too long," he continued, a sick look of triumph on his face. "You need to learn how the real world works. You need to finally grow up and stand on your own 2 feet. So, as of tonight, the charity is over." The silence that followed was absolute. It was deafening. I sat there, my hand still resting on the stem of my water glass. I looked at the faces around my table. I looked at Melissa, who was nodding slightly, pretending to be deeply pained by this necessary boundary. I looked at Bexley, who was literally biting her lip to keep from smiling at my public humiliation. I looked at Harrison, who was staring at his plate in extreme discomfort. And then I looked at my children. Liam was staring at me, his little fist clenched under the table, his face flushed with secondhand shame. Harper looked terrified, shrinking back into her chair as if Trevor had physically struck her. In that exact fraction of a second, something inside me didn't just break, it completely disintegrated. For years, I had absorbed their insults. I had paid their literal mortgages, their taxes, their medical bills, and I had allowed them to treat me like a parasite just so they could feel tall. I had swallowed the poison to keep the peace. But looking at my children's faces, watching them absorb the lie that their mother was a pathetic, helpless burden, I experienced a moment of terrifying, diamond-clear lucidity. The fog of lifelong emotional abuse evaporated in an instant. I realized that if I did not stop this right now, I was teaching my son and my daughter that love means letting people destroy you. I did not cry. I did not yell. The time for arguing with these people had passed years ago. I slowly stood up. The scraping of my wooden chair against the floorboard sounded like a gunshot in the silent room. Trevor looked at me, a smug, expectant look in his eyes. He was waiting for me to apologize. He was waiting for me to beg. He was waiting for the familiar script to play out. Instead, I looked at my children. Liam, Harper, go put your coats and your boots on. Right now. What are you doing? Melissa whispered, her eyes widening in sudden, genuine alarm. This was not in the script. The scapegoat wasn't supposed to go off script. You're being dramatic, Trevor scoffed, waving his hand dismissively. Sit down. Can't you take a little constructive criticism? I walked over to the hall tree, grabbing my keys and my own heavy winter coat. I turned back to look at the people sitting at my beautiful table, eating the food I had bought with my money, cooked with my hands, in the house I owned entirely by myself. If you are quite done pretending that your fragile ego is the same thing as generosity, I said, my voice so low and cold it didn't even sound like my own. Then I am done providing an audience for your delusions. Finish the food, drink the wine, and then get out of my house. You can't talk to your father like that, Melissa gasped, clutching her chest. Watch me, I said. I didn't wait to see their reactions. I didn't wait for Bexley's snide remark or Trevor's explosive rage. I took Liam by the hand, placed my other hand gently on Harper's back, and walked out the front door into the freezing, snow-covered Providence night. I buckled my children into the back of my old Volvo. The heater hadn't even kicked in yet, and our breath plumed in the cold air. Mom? Liam asked, his voice trembling as I gripped the steering wheel, staring blankly at the frost on the windshield. Are we in trouble? I looked at him in the rearview mirror, my heart breaking and healing all at the same time. No, sweetie, I said quietly, putting the car into drive. For the first time in a very long time, we are completely fine. We're just done playing make-believe. I drove away from my own house, leaving them sitting in the mess of their own making. I drove aimlessly for hours, the heater finally warming the car, the soft hum of the engine lulling the kids to sleep in the back seat. I thought that leaving the house was the climax of the night. I thought the worst was over. I had absolutely no idea what Melissa was about to do, or the absolute hellfire I was preparing to rain down on all of them in response. I drove around the icy streets of Providence for nearly 2 hours. The heater in the old Volvo finally blasted warm air, and the rhythmic hum of the tires on the plowed roads lulled Liam and Harper into a deep, exhausted sleep in the back seat. I gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles were white, my mind racing through 1,000 different scenarios. I kept expecting my phone sitting in the cup holder to ring. I expected a furious call from Trevor demanding I return and face my punishment. I expected a panicked text from Melissa begging me not to make a scene, but the phone stayed entirely dark, not a single notification. Around midnight, I finally circled back to my street. The snow was falling heavier now, blanketing the historic brick sidewalks. I parked a few houses down and left the engine running, staring at my own front windows. The lights were out, the driveway was empty. Bexley's leased SUV and my parents' sedan were gone. I carried Harper inside, her head heavy on my shoulder, while Liam trudged sleepily behind me, dragging his coat. When I unlocked the heavy wooden front door and stepped into the hallway, the silence of the house hit me like a physical blow. They hadn't just left. They had left a monument to their disrespect. The dining room was exactly as I had abandoned it, but worse. Someone, likely Bexley, had knocked over a half-full glass of red wine. It had pooled across my antique lace tablecloth, soaking into the fabric like a dark, ugly bruise. The prime rib was left uncovered, drying out in the center of the table. Crumbled napkins, dirty forks, and push-back chairs made the room look like the site of a hasty evacuation. They hadn't cleared a single plate. They hadn't put a single piece of food in the refrigerator. They had consumed my hospitality, insulted my very existence in front of my children, and walked out, leaving me to clean up their physical and emotional mess. I tucked my children into their beds, kissing their foreheads, whispering that they were safe, that they were loved, and that tomorrow we would have our own private Christmas morning. Then I walked back downstairs. I didn't cry. I didn't rage. I felt a strange, hollow calmness settling over me. I rolled up the sleeves of my oversized sweater, gathered the ruined tablecloth, and threw it in the trash. I scraped the expensive food into the garbage disposal. I washed every dish by hand, the hot water scalding my skin, washing away the remnants of the people who shared my DNA but had never once been my family. By the time I finally collapsed into my own bed, it was nearly 3 a.m. I plugged my phone into the charger on my nightstand, grateful for the silence. I assumed that their lack of communication meant they were giving me the silent treatment, their favorite weapon of choice. Whenever I stepped out of line, they would freeze me out for weeks, waiting for me to crack, waiting for me to come crawling back with an apology and an open checkbook. I fell into a heavy, dreamless sleep, thinking the worst of the storm had passed. I was so incredibly wrong. I woke up at 6:45 a.m. to a sound that sent a jolt of pure adrenaline straight into my chest. My phone was vibrating against the wooden nightstand with such aggressive, relentless intensity that it was literally inching its way toward the edge. It was a continuous mechanical buzzing that meant someone was calling, hanging up, and immediately calling back. I sat up, my heart hammering against my ribs. For one split second, my mind went to the darkest place, an accident on the icy roads, a medical emergency. I snatched the phone from the charger. My lock screen was a wall of terrifying notifications. 38 missed calls, 42 unread text messages. The names blurring together on the screen weren't just Trevor or Melissa. They were names of extended family members who hadn't spoken to me in months. Aunt Evelyn, 3 missed calls. Cousin Sarah, text, "What the hell is wrong with you?" Uncle David, text, "Call your mother immediately. She is devastated." Bexley, text, "You are a psycho. Take it down right now." Take what down? My hands were shaking as I unlocked the screen. The barrage of messages made absolutely no sense until I opened a text from my cousin Sarah. It was a screenshot of a Facebook post. I tapped the image, and the last shred of empathy I had for my mother evaporated into the cold morning air. At 1:12 a.m., while I was downstairs scrubbing dried gravy off the plates she had abandoned, Melissa had taken out her smartphone, logged onto Facebook, and detonated a bomb. She hadn't tried to stop Trevor's abuse. She hadn't felt bad for my children. She had seen an opportunity to weaponize the situation, to solidify her role as the ultimate, long-suffering victim of a cruel, ungrateful daughter. The post featured a carefully cropped photo of my dining table from earlier in the evening, before the screaming started. It showed the glowing candles, the expensive wine, and a blur of the children's faces in the background. It looked like a Hallmark movie. And then I read the caption. "The hardest Christmas of my entire life. Some people only know how to take and take from their family until the very moment loving boundaries are finally set. Trevor and I have sacrificed everything to help Kinsley stay afloat, but peace sometimes costs you a daughter's anger. Please pray for our family tonight as we navigate this heartbreaking rejection. Grandparents are not free labor. We just wanted to be respected." I stared at the screen, my breath catching in my throat. The sheer, unadulterated audacity of it made the room spin. Beneath her post were over 60 comments from our extended family, friends, and people from her church. "Praying for you, Melissa. Boundaries are so important. I always knew she was taking advantage of you and Trevor. Stay strong. How could she do this to you on Christmas Eve after everything you've bought for those kids?" And there, right at the top, was a comment from Bexley. "So proud of you and Dad for finally standing up to her toxic behavior. We love you." I lowered the phone to my lap. I sat in the semi-darkness of my bedroom, listening to the soft, rhythmic breathing of my children sleeping in the rooms down the hall. In the past, this was the exact moment I would have broken. This was the moment the old Kinsley would have panicked. The fear of being misunderstood, the terror of being ostracized by the entire extended family would have sent me spiraling. I would have called Melissa, crying, begging her to take it down. I would have promised to pay for whatever they wanted, just to stop the public humiliation. I would have let them rewrite history, just to make the pain stop. but the old Kinsley had died at that dinner table the moment Trevor looked at my 6-year-old daughter with contempt. I didn't feel panic. I didn't feel the urge to cry. I felt a cold, surgical precision settle over my brain. It was a feeling of absolute, terrifying clarity. My mother wanted an audience. She wanted witnesses to her martyrdom. Fine. I would give her the best show of her life. I didn't call anyone back. I ignored the vibrating phone. I walked into my kitchen, made a pot of strong black coffee, and carried a steaming mug into my home office. I sat down at my heavy oak desk and opened my MacBook. Because I restore antique books for a living, I am a meticulous record keeper. I deal with provenance, insurance values, and chain of custody for items worth tens of thousands of dollars. I do not do things based on memory. I do things based on documentation. About 3 years ago, when the financial demands from my family started escalating, I noticed a pattern. Whenever I brought up the money I had lent them, Trevor would gaslight me. It wasn't $3,000, Kinsley, it was barely $1,000, he would scoff. Melissa would wave her hand and say, "Oh, you offered that as a gift. Don't be so transactional." They made me feel like I was losing my mind. So, to protect my own sanity, I had created a hidden folder on my laptop. It was an Excel spreadsheet simply titled Family Transfers. I double-clicked the file. It opened instantly, a stark, undeniable ledger of their hypocrisy. I had logged every single date, every dollar amount, the excuse they used to ask for it, and the bank confirmation numbers. I also kept a subfolder of screenshots, text messages of Melissa begging, Bexley crying about foreclosure, Trevor demanding I cover his copays before his insurance dropped him. It wasn't a ledger born of malice. It was an armor of self-defense, and today I was going to put it on. I scrolled through the rows, the blue glow of the screen reflecting in my eyes. October 14th, Melissa Carter property taxes, $4,243, paid directly to the county assessor. August 2nd, Trevor Carter medical deductible, $3,500, transferred to joint checking. April 18th, Bexley mortgage shortfall, $2,800, wire transfer. November 9th, Melissa and Trevor winter furnace replacement, $6,100. The list went on and on. Thousands upon thousands of dollars generated by my chaotic, failing business, quietly funneled to keep their perfect upper-middle-class illusion intact. I didn't need to post the whole spreadsheet. I only needed a surgical strike. I took 3 specific screenshots. First, the bank confirmation for Melissa's property taxes placed side by side with a text from her that read, "Please, Kinsley, if we don't pay this by Friday, they'll put a lien on the house. Your father is so stressed his blood pressure is spiking. Please." Second, the wire transfer to Bexley for her mortgage. Third, the invoice for the $6,100 furnace paid in full from my business account, right next to a text from Trevor saying, "Don't tell your Aunt Evelyn about the furnace. It's nobody's business." I opened a new tab and logged into Facebook. I navigated to Melissa's page. The post was still there, sitting at the top of her feed like a glittering monument to her ego. The comment count had climbed to 85. I didn't write an essay. I didn't defend my character. I didn't sound angry or hysterical. The ultimate power in dealing with narcissists is proving that they cannot affect your emotional baseline. I clicked the comment box and typed a single, devastatingly calm paragraph. "Loving boundaries is an interesting phrase, Mom. Since we are having a public family meeting this morning, let's make sure the extended family has the accurate financial minutes. In the last 3 years alone, I have paid your delinquent property taxes, Dad's medical deductibles, the $6,100 for your new furnace, and Bexley's missing mortgage payments. Dad watched me quietly fund your entire lifestyle, and then stood up at my Christmas table and told my children I am a burden who lives off his charity because he replaced a kitchen faucet. If you want peace and respect, maybe try starting with the truth. Happy holidays." I attached the 3 screenshots. I hit enter, and then I sat back in my leather chair, picked up my coffee mug, and watched the internet do what it does best. In the world of online family drama, there is a specific, measurable unit of time. I call it the narcissist's lag. It's the gap between the moment the absolute truth is dropped into a public forum and the moment the liar realizes their entire social currency has just evaporated. For 3 minutes, nothing happened. The post sat there. My comment sat at the very bottom, a ticking time bomb waiting to be noticed. In minute 4, the dynamic shifted. My phone, which had been vibrating with angry texts from flying monkeys all morning, suddenly went dead silent. It was as if all the oxygen had been sucked out of the eastern seaboard. In minute 5, a notification popped up on the screen. Aunt Evelyn replied to your comment. Wait, what? Melissa, is this true? Then came Cousin Sarah, the one who had called me a psycho an hour earlier. Cousin Sarah replied to your comment. Kinsley paid your taxes? You told us she was bankrupt. Then came Uncle David. Uncle David, Trevor let Kinsley pay for the furnace? He told me he cashed out his bonds for that. The facade was cracking in real time. The people who had spent the last 8 hours comforting Melissa and stroking her ego were suddenly realizing they had been manipulated into attacking the only person who was actually keeping the Carter family out of a cardboard box. I could almost visualize the sheer, unadulterated panic erupting in my parents' house 20 miles away. I imagined Trevor's face turning a dangerous shade of purple as he realized his brother David now knew he couldn't afford his own heating bill. I imagined Melissa scrambling to find her reading glasses, her hands shaking as she saw her carefully crafted image of the wealthy, charitable matriarch burning to the ground in the comment section. At exactly 7 minutes and 42 seconds after I hit enter, the screen flashed. This content isn't available right now. Melissa had deleted the post. She pulled the plug. She scorched the earth. But anyone who has ever survived a toxic family knows that 7 minutes is an eternity on the internet. 7 minutes is more than enough time for screenshots to be taken, for group chats to be created, and for the Whisper network to ignite. Deleting the post didn't erase the evidence, it only confirmed their guilt. By hitting delete, Melissa had effectively screamed, "I am lying and I am caught." My phone lit up again, but this time, the tone of the notifications had drastically changed. The aggressive, demanding phone calls were gone. In their place were hesitant, confused text messages. Aunt Evelyn texted, "Kinsley, honey, I took a screenshot before she deleted it. I am so sorry. I had no idea. Please call me when you are ready." Cousin Sarah texted, "I feel sick. I am so sorry for what I said this morning. Aunt Melissa told us you demanded they pay for Liam's school and yelled at them when they couldn't." I didn't reply to any of them. I didn't need to host a press conference. The receipts had spoken for me. Suddenly, a new text popped up on my screen. It wasn't an apology. It was a message from Bexley. It was typed so fast, it was full of typos, radiating pure, unhinged panic. Bexley, "You bitch! How could you do that to Mom and Dad? You ruined everything. Harrison saw the post. Harrison saw the screenshot about the mortgage. Answer your phone right now." I stared at the text, my brow furrowing in confusion. Harrison saw the screenshot about the mortgage? Why would that induce such a meltdown? Harrison was her husband. He was on the deed to their house. He obviously knew they had fallen behind on their mortgage and needed my help. Didn't he? My phone vibrated again. An incoming call. The caller ID didn't say Bexley. It didn't say Melissa or Trevor. It was Harrison. I looked at the flashing name. Harrison was a good man. He worked long hours at an engineering firm, he adored my kids, and he had always treated me with quiet respect, even when the rest of the family treated me like the hired help. I swiped right and brought the phone to my ear. "Hello?" I said, my voice steady. "Kinsley!" Harrison's voice came through the speaker. He didn't sound angry. He sounded hollowed out. He sounded like a man who had just had the floor drop out from underneath him. "I need you to tell me the truth, and I need you to not protect her." "I'm not protecting anyone anymore, Harrison," I replied softly. I heard him take a shaky breath on the other end of the line. "The screenshot you posted. The wire transfer for $2,800 back in April. You labeled it Bexley Mortgage Shortfall." "Yes," I confirmed. "Bexley called me crying. She said your firm had messed up your bonus, the account was overdrawn, and if you missed the payment, it would tank your credit score. I wired it directly to her personal checking account so she could transfer it to the joint account." There was a long, agonizing silence on the other end of the line. When Harrison finally spoke, his voice was barely a whisper, thick with a betrayal so deep it made my own chest ache. "My firm never messed up my bonus, Kinsley. We've never missed a mortgage payment. Our joint account was fully funded." The pieces clicked together in my brain with sickening speed. The designer coats, the Aspen ski trips, the perfect Instagram aesthetic. "Harrison," I started, not knowing what to say. "She didn't use that money for the house, Kinsley," he said, his voice cracking with a mixture of rage and profound embarrassment. "I just forced her to log into her personal accounts. She has $40,000 in hidden credit card debt. She's been taking money from you, telling me that you were financially illiterate and begging her for handouts, and she was using your money to pay the minimums on her secret Amex card so I wouldn't find out. My sister hadn't just used me as an ATM. She had used my money to fund a fraudulent lifestyle while simultaneously destroying my reputation to her own husband to cover her tracks. The level of sociopathic manipulation was staggering. "I am so sorry, Kinsley," Harrison said, his voice hardening into something resolute and final. "I am so incredibly sorry for how they have treated you. I am packing a bag. I'm going to my brother's house." "Harrison, wait." The line went dead. I slowly lowered the phone. The house around me was completely silent. The morning sun was just starting to crest over the snow-covered roofs of Providence, casting long, sharp shadows across my office floor. I had dropped a match to protect myself, but I hadn't realized my entire family had built their lives out of gasoline. The velvet curtain hadn't just fallen. It had caught fire, and the real burning was just about to begin. I stood in my home office for a long time after Harrison's call disconnected, listening to the dead dial tone. The silence of the house was profound, broken only by the soft hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen and the gentle whistle of the winter wind rattling the antique window panes. Bexley hadn't just lied. She had orchestrated a masterclass in financial and emotional manipulation, using me as her personal slush fund while simultaneously painting me as a parasite to her own husband to cover her tracks. She had weaponized my empathy, and now the explosive detonation of that lie was echoing through the entire Carter family. I set the phone face down on my desk. For the first time in 34 years, I did not feel the crushing, suffocating weight of anxiety that usually followed a family conflict. I didn't feel the desperate urge to fix it, to apologize, to smooth over the rough edges of their dysfunction. Instead, I felt a deep, resonant sense of liberation. It was as if I had been carrying a 100-pound boulder on my back my entire life, and I had finally just decided to put it down and walk away. I walked upstairs to check on Liam and Harper. They were still fast asleep, their small chests rising and falling in rhythmic peace. I spent the next few hours reclaiming my home. I threw open the curtains, letting the crisp, brilliant winter sunlight flood the rooms. I made a massive batch of cinnamon rolls from scratch, the sweet, buttery scent chasing away the lingering, stale energy of my parents' presence. When the kids finally woke up, they padded downstairs in their matching pajamas, their eyes wide with excitement. We had the most beautiful, quiet Christmas morning I had ever experienced. There were no passive-aggressive comments about the gifts I had chosen. There was no Trevor sighing loudly to ensure everyone knew he was bored. There was no Melissa criticizing my parenting. It was just the three of us, sitting on the rug by the fireplace, drinking hot cocoa and laughing until our sides ached. Liam, my perceptive 10-year-old, looked up at me as he assembled a new Lego set. "Mom?" he asked, his brow furrowed slightly. "Is Grandpa Trevor mad at us? Is that why they left?" I stopped picking up the torn wrapping paper and sat down next to him, pulling him into a side hug. "Grandpa Trevor is dealing with some grown-up feelings," I said carefully, choosing my words to be honest but age-appropriate. "Sometimes people forget how to be kind, even to their family. And when people can't be kind, we don't have to stay around them. Our job is to protect our own peace. You and Harper didn't do anything wrong. You are perfect exactly the way you are." Liam nodded, seemingly satisfied with the answer, and went back to his Legos. Kids are incredibly resilient, but they are also incredibly observant. They know when the air in a room is toxic, and they know when they are finally safe. While my house was a sanctuary of peace, the Carter family group chats were a war zone. I didn't engage, but I watched the notifications roll in. Aunt Evelyn, my mother's older sister and the undisputed matriarch of the extended family, called me at 2 p.m. Evelyn was a no-nonsense woman who had always suspected Trevor was a fraud, but had never had the evidence to prove it. "Kinsley," Evelyn said, her voice sharp but laced with genuine concern. "I just got off the phone with your mother. She is hysterical. She claims your Facebook account was hacked, and then she claimed you photoshopped those bank statements because you are jealous of Bexley." I actually laughed out loud. It was a dark, dry chuckle. "And do you believe that, Aunt Evelyn?" "Of course I don't believe that," Evelyn scoffed. "Your mother has been spinning tales since we were in grade school. But Kinsley, the furnace? You paid for that?" Trevor sat in my living room at Thanksgiving and complained about how he had to dip into his retirement fund to keep his house warm. He played the martyr for an hour. "He didn't pay a dime," Aunt Evelyn. I wrote the check directly to the HVAC company. I have the cleared invoice. Evelyn sighed heavily, a sound of profound disappointment. David called him out on it this morning. Trevor hung up on him. The whole family is in an uproar. And what's this about Harrison leaving? Harrison called me right after the post went up, I explained, keeping my voice neutral. He saw the screenshot of the wire transfer to Bexley. He had no idea they were behind on their mortgage, except they weren't behind on their mortgage. Bexley was using the money to pay off secret credit card debt she'd been hiding from him. Good Lord, Evelyn whispered. It's a house of cards, the whole lot of them. It was, I corrected her gently, but I'm no longer the foundation holding it up. Good for you, honey, Evelyn said, and I could hear the fierce pride in her voice. You protect those babies of yours. Let Trevor and Melissa sleep in the bed they made. By the evening of December 26th, the silence from my immediate family broke. They had realized that the smear campaign had failed. The flying monkeys had retreated. The narrative had slipped entirely out of their control, and for a narcissist, loss of control is a fate worse than death. My phone buzzed with a new voicemail. It was Trevor. I put it on speakerphone and let it play in the empty kitchen. Kinsley! His voice boomed, carrying that familiar, heavy tone of artificial authority, though I could hear the ragged edge of panic underneath it. This little stunt of yours has gone far enough. You have completely ruined Christmas. You have weaponized money to humiliate your own mother, and you have deliberately sabotaged your sister's marriage out of pure spite. I will not have my family torn apart by your childish tantrums. We need to talk, face to face, like adults. Meet us at the Route 1 diner tomorrow at noon. Do not be late. There was no apology. There was no accountability. It was a classic Darvo tactic. Deny the abuse, attack the victim, and reverse the roles of victim and offender. In his mind, he was the victim of my weaponized money, completely ignoring the fact that he had stood in my house and publicly shamed me for a faucet repair while I was funding his entire life. I almost deleted the message and blocked his number right then and there, but I realized something crucial. If I just disappeared, they would spend the rest of their lives telling people I was too cowardly to face them. They would rewrite the ending of this story to make themselves the victors. I needed to sever the cord in person. I needed to look them in the eye, unbothered and unshakable, and let them know that the bank was permanently closed and the audience had permanently left the theater. The Route 1 diner was a relic from the 1980s, sitting off a bleak stretch of highway just outside the city limits. It smelled permanently of stale coffee, burnt hash browns, and industrial bleach. It was exactly the kind of place Trevor loved, a place where the waitresses called him Han, and he could complain about the prices to feel economically superior. It was neutral ground, which in Trevor's language meant a place where he could control the volume and the exit. I arrived at exactly 12:05 p.m. the next day. I didn't wear my comfortable studio clothes. I dressed like the high-end artisan I was. A tailored black wool coat, dark trousers, and a pair of leather boots that cost more than Trevor's monthly pension. I looked polished, untouchable, and completely out of place in the dingy diner. It was my armor. I spotted them immediately in a corner booth near the back. The visual contrast to the perfect, glittering family they pretended to be was staggering. Trevor looked 10 years older. His face was a mottled red, his jaw set in a furious, rigid line. Melissa looked haggard, clutching a crumpled tissue, her eyes darting around nervously to see if anyone in the diner was watching her perform her tragedy. But it was Bexley who looked the worst. The golden child's aura had completely shattered. Her hair was pulled back in a messy bun, her face was devoid of makeup, and her eyes were swollen and bloodshot from crying. The designer clothes were gone, replaced by a rumpled, oversized sweatshirt. Harrison had actually left. The consequence of her sociopathy had finally crashed into her reality. I walked over, my footsteps clicking sharply against the linoleum floor. I didn't take off my coat. I slid into the cracked vinyl booth opposite them, keeping my posture perfectly straight. "You're late," Trevor snapped, glaring at me over his black coffee. "I'm exactly when I intended to be," I replied smoothly, folding my hands on the table. "You have 10 minutes. What do you want?" Melissa let out a dramatic, shuddering sob, pressing the tissue to her nose. "How can you be so cold, Kinsley? Look at your sister. Look at what you've done to her. Harrison won't even return her calls." "I didn't force Bexley to take out $40,000 in secret credit card debt," I said, my voice eerily calm. I looked directly at my sister, refusing to let her look away. I didn't force her to lie to her husband, and I certainly didn't force her to use my money. Money I worked grueling hours to earn for my own children, to fund her fake lifestyle. You did that to yourself, Bexley. The only thing I did was stop covering your tracks. You posted my private financial information on the internet, Bexley hissed, leaning forward, her face contorted with pure hatred. You knew Harrison's family would see it. You did it to ruin me because you've always been jealous of me. Jealous of what? I asked, tilting my head slightly. Your leased car? Your maxed out Amex? Your husband who just realized he married a con artist? No, Bexley, I'm not jealous. I'm exhausted. And I'm done. Trevor slammed his thick hand flat against the Formica table, making the silverware rattle. A few heads turned in the diner, but I didn't flinch. That is enough, Trevor barked, using his manager voice. You do not speak to your sister that way. You do not disrespect your mother. You have humiliated this family in front of David, in front of Evelyn, in front of the whole damn church. You had no right to air our private business, Kinsley. You stood in my dining room, in front of my children, and called me a burden, I reminded him, my voice never rising above a conversational, lethal level. You made a public announcement that you were cutting me off when the only thing you've ever contributed to my life is stress and a $20 faucet. You chose the public arena, Trevor. I just brought the receipts. The use of his first name, not Dad, but Trevor, hit him like a physical blow. His face went from red to a dangerous, violent purple. The mask of the aggrieved, loving father melted off completely, revealing the raging, narcissistic core beneath. You ungrateful little bitch, Trevor spat, leaning over the table, his breath smelling of stale coffee and malice. You think a few pennies give you the right to trample me? You think because you threw a few bucks at your mother's taxes, you get to dictate how this family runs? You are nothing. You repair old garbage for a living. You couldn't even keep a husband. Without us, you are a pathetic, lonely woman raising 2 kids who are going to grow up just as broken as you are. Melissa gasped, not out of defense for me, but because Trevor was saying the quiet part out loud in a public place. Trevor, please, people are looking. Let them look, he roared, pointing a thick, shaking finger inches from my face. I am the head of this family. I built this family. You owe me respect. You owe me everything. I looked at his shaking finger. I looked at the spittle flying from his lips. I looked at Melissa, who was shrinking into the vinyl booth, and Bexley, who was staring at the table, completely consumed by her own self-pity. I didn't feel anger. I felt profound pity. They were so small. They were so empty. They had built an entire religion out of their own egos, and they were furious that the collection plate was finally empty. I owe you nothing, I said, my voice ringing with a final, absolute authority. I reached into my designer purse, pulled out a crisp $20 bill, and laid it deliberately on the table over his coffee cup. That's to cover your coffee, and that is the very last dollar you or anyone in this family will ever get from me. Trevor stared at the money as if it were a venomous snake. I stood up, adjusting the lapels of my coat. I looked down at the 3 of them, the architects of my childhood misery, the parasites of my adulthood. We are done, I said, looking Trevor dead in the eyes. You don't get to call me. You don't get to text me. And most importantly, you do not get to see Liam and Harper ever again. You will not pass your generational poison down to my children. If you come to my house, I will call the police and have you arrested for trespassing. If you show up at their school, I will file a restraining order. You can't do that, Melissa cried out, finally dropping the tissue, her eyes wide with genuine terror. Losing access to their grandchildren meant losing her ultimate prop for social media sympathy. Kinsley, please, you're breaking my heart. Your heart was broken a long time ago, Melissa, I said softly, looking at her with cold detachment. You just spent your life trying to make everyone else bleed for it. You're a monster, Bexley whispered, glaring up at me through her tears. No, I replied, turning my back to the booth. I'm just the mirror you finally couldn't break. I didn't wait for Trevor's explosive response. I didn't look back as I walked down the narrow aisle of the diner, past the stunned waitress, and pushed open the heavy glass doors. The icy December wind hit my face, sharp and biting, but it felt like the cleanest air I had ever breathed. I walked to my car, my boots crunching against the salt and snow on the asphalt. I unlocked the Volvo, slid into the driver's seat, and closed the door, sealing myself in the quiet, safe cocoon of my own life. I put the key in the ignition, and for the first time since this entire nightmare began, I smiled. A real, genuine smile that reached all the way to my eyes. The toxic negotiation was over. The boundaries were set in titanium. But I didn't know that my family's collapse was only just beginning, and that Aunt Evelyn was about to hand me the final puzzle piece that explained decades of my father's psychotic behavior. The days immediately following that diner confrontation felt like breathing pure oxygen after a lifetime of living underwater. When you finally cut ties with a narcissistic family system, society conditions you to expect immediate, crushing guilt. Television shows and movies love to push the narrative that family is everything, implying that no matter how toxic the blood is, you are somehow fundamentally broken if you walk away from it. But reality is remarkably different. I didn't feel guilty. I felt an overwhelming, profound sense of safety. I didn't just walk away, I built a fortress. The very next morning, I called a local security company and had the locks changed on my historic townhouse. I installed heavy-duty deadbolts and a state-of-the-art camera system that covered the front porch, the driveway, and the back garden. Trevor had a terrifying habit of dropping by unannounced to inspect my property and tell me what I was doing wrong. That era was officially over. If he stepped foot on my cobblestone walkway, I would have him arrested for trespassing. I was no longer playing by the rules of family etiquette. I was playing by the rules of the law. Next, I drove to Liam and Harper's elementary school. I sat down in the principal's office, a warm, understanding woman who had seen her fair share of custody battles and family drama. I handed her a printed, notarized document stating that under no circumstances were Trevor or Melissa Carter authorized to pick up my children, visit them on school grounds, or be given any information regarding their schedules. I provided printed photographs of their faces to the front desk. They are not safe people, I told the principal, my voice unwavering. If they show up and demand to see my kids, please do not call me to negotiate. Call the police. The principal looked at the photos, then looked at me, her expression softening with professional empathy. We have a strict protocol for this, Ms. Carter. Your children are safe here. You did the right thing. Walking out of that school, I felt a physical weight lift from my shoulders. The access points were closed. The vault was locked. I was finally the sole author of my children's environment. As January rolled in, bringing heavy snowstorms that buried Providence under blankets of white, my book restoration business experienced an unprecedented surge. Without the constant, draining, emotional vampire of my family sucking away my energy, my creativity skyrocketed. I took on a massive commission from a private collector in Boston to restore a severely water-damaged, leather-bound collection of 18th century poetry. I spent my days in my warm studio, the smell of archival paste and aged parchment filling the air, listening to classical music while the snow fell outside my floor-to-ceiling windows. I was meticulously repairing history, completely detached from the chaotic history I had just left behind. But while my world was characterized by quiet, lucrative peace, the Carter family was experiencing a spectacular, slow-motion collapse. When you remove the scapegoat from a toxic family, the remaining members don't suddenly become healthy. They turn on each other. The toxicity needs a target. Without me to blame for their unhappiness, without my bank account to cushion their terrible decisions, the illusions they had built their lives upon began to shatter. I didn't seek out the information, but in a family as loud and dramatic as mine, the fallout was impossible to ignore. The grapevine delivered the news directly to my door. Harrison actually went through with the separation. He didn't just leave Bexley, he legally protected himself. Through Aunt Evelyn, I learned that Harrison had hired a forensic accountant for the divorce proceedings. The $40,000 in secret credit card debt was just the tip of the iceberg. Bexley had been taking out hidden personal loans and opening store cards in Harrison's name to fund her designer wardrobe, the Aspen trips, and the luxury car leases. She had built a financial house of horrors, and the moment my quiet wire transfers stopped acting as her safety net, the entire structure caved in. Bexley was forced to move out of their beautiful 5-bedroom suburban home and into a cramped 1-bedroom apartment. Her Instagram account, once a glittering shrine to her fake wealth, went completely dark. The golden child had been exposed as a fraud, and Trevor and Melissa, who had always paraded her around as their ultimate achievement, were suddenly incredibly quiet. Melissa tried to pivot her strategy. She attempted to play the tragic, abandoned matriarch at her church, crying to her prayer group about how both her daughters had lost their way. But the screenshots I had posted were permanent ink on her reputation. People in our hometown weren't stupid. They smiled politely at Melissa in the grocery store, but the dinner party invitations stopped. The request for Trevor to serve on community boards vanished. Trevor, a man whose entire identity relied on being the respected, wealthy patriarch, found himself completely isolated. He had no audience left. He had no one to lecture. The kingdom he thought he ruled had turned out to be an empty room. It was late January on a brutally cold Tuesday afternoon when the final devastating puzzle piece of my father's psychology fell into place. I was in my studio using a bone folder to smooth down a delicate piece of Japanese tissue paper on a torn manuscript when the doorbell rang. I glanced at the security monitor on my desk. Standing on my porch, wrapped in a heavy wool coat and a thick scarf, was Aunt Evelyn. I pressed the buzzer to unlock the door and went out to the hallway to greet her. Evelyn stomped the snow off her boots and enveloped me in a tight, fiercely warm hug. She smelled of peppermint and expensive perfume. "Look at you," she said, pulling back to examine my face. "You look lighter, Kinsley. You look like you're actually breathing." "I am, Aunt Evelyn, for the first time in my life." I smiled, taking her coat. "Come into the studio. I'll make us some tea." We sat in the 2 plush velvet armchairs by the radiator in my workspace. Evelyn held her steaming mug of Earl Grey, her sharp, intelligent eyes scanning my shelves of antique books. She had always been the black sheep of her generation, independent, unmarried by choice, and entirely immune to Melissa's manipulative tears. "I didn't come just to check on you, honey," Evelyn said, her tone shifting to something serious, almost solemn. She set her mug down on a coaster. "I came because there is something you need to know, something that makes this entire nightmare make sense." I leaned back, crossing my arms defensively. "If Melissa sent you to negotiate?" "God, no," Evelyn interrupted, waving her hand in disgust. "I haven't spoken to your mother in 3 weeks. She's too busy blaming the devil for Bexley's divorce." "No, Kinsley. I'm here because of a conversation I had with David last night. We were putting some timelines together regarding your father's finances." Evelyn leaned forward, looking me dead in the eye. "Kinsley, 5 years ago, right around the time your business really started taking off, you gave your parents a massive amount of money. Do you remember what it was for?" I frowned, tracing the timeline in my head. 5 years ago, Liam was 5, Harper was a baby. I had just landed my first major museum contract. "Yes," I said slowly. Melissa came to my house sobbing. She said Trevor had been named in a massive, frivolous lawsuit from a contractor he used to work with, and that if they didn't settle out of court immediately, Trevor would lose his pension and they would be ruined. She begged me not to tell him she asked because his pride couldn't take it. I wrote her a cashier's check for $35,000. I drained half my savings to keep him out of court. Evelyn closed her eyes, a look of profound, sickening realization washing over her face. "Oh, Kinsley." "What?" I asked, a cold knot forming in my stomach. "Aunt Evelyn, what was the money really for?" Evelyn opened her eyes. They were shining with unshed tears of pure anger. "There was no lawsuit, Kinsley. Trevor was never sued." I stared at her, the silence in the studio suddenly roaring in my ears. "Then what did I pay for?" 5 years ago, Trevor made a series of catastrophic, arrogant investments in a commercial real estate venture he knew nothing about, Evelyn said, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "He drained their savings. He remortgaged their house to the hilt, and he lost everything. The bank initiated foreclosure. Their house, the house Trevor parades around in like he's the king of the neighborhood, was going up for public auction." The air left my lungs. "Melissa took your $35,000, Evelyn continued, her voice trembling with rage, and she handed it directly to the bank to reinstate the mortgage and stop the foreclosure auction with only 48 hours to spare." I sat completely frozen in the velvet chair. The antique books around me seemed to blur. "Trevor knew?" I whispered. "Of course he knew," Evelyn said bitterly. "He knew exactly where the money came from. But his ego was so fragile, so pathologically immense, that he couldn't handle the reality of his own failure. He couldn't handle the fact that the daughter he constantly belittled, the woman he called a struggling single mom, was the only reason he wasn't sleeping in a motel. The puzzle pieces didn't just fall into place. They slammed together with the force of a freight train. Every cruel comment, every public humiliation, the constant obsessive need to tear down my business, my home, my parenting. The grand theatrical speech at my Christmas table about how he was done bailing me out. It wasn't just narcissism. It was a severe, toxic case of psychological projection. Trevor suffered a massive narcissistic injury the day I saved his home. Every time he looked at me, he didn't see his daughter. He saw the living, breathing proof of his ultimate failure as a man. Every time he walked through the front door of his house, he knew, deep down in his rotten core, that I had bought that door. I owned the roof over his head. To survive that reality, his mind had to invent a fantasy. He had to convince himself and everyone around him that I was the incompetent one. He had to humiliate me in public to balance the scales in his own twisted mind. He punished me for 5 years simply because I had saved him. He hated you, Kinsley, Evelyn said softly, reaching out to grab my hand. He hated you because he owed you his literal survival. And weak men despise the women who are strong enough to carry them. I looked down at Evelyn's hand holding mine. I expected to feel devastated. I expected to feel the sting of a $35,000 betrayal. But as the seconds ticked by, the strangest sensation washed over me. It was a feeling of absolute, unbreakable power. I wasn't a victim. I hadn't been tricked because I was stupid. I had been lied to because my father was a coward. I hadn't just been surviving my family. I had literally been the architect of their survival. I was the strongest person in my entire bloodline, and they had spent my entire life trying to convince me I was weak because they were terrified of what would happen if I ever realized my own strength. Well, I realized it now. I pulled my hand back gently, stood up, and walked over to the massive windows looking out at the snowy Providence Street. "Thank you for telling me, Aunt Evelyn," I said, my voice steady, devoid of any tears. "What are you going to do?" she asked, watching me carefully. "Are you going to confront him?" I turned back to face her, a cool, terrifyingly calm smile touching my lips. "Confront him? Why would I do that?" I asked. "He already knows what he did, and now he knows that I know. He is a disgraced, broke old man sitting in a house that I bought, watching his favorite daughter get divorced because she's a fraud just like him. His punishment isn't me screaming at him. His punishment is having to wake up every single day and be Trevor Carter." Evelyn stared at me for a long moment, and then a slow, respectful smile spread across her face. "You are terrifying, Kinsley Carter, and I have never been more proud to be your aunt." When Evelyn left that afternoon, I didn't cry. I went back to my desk, picked up my bone folder, and continued smoothing the delicate tissue paper over the torn 18th century manuscript. I repaired the broken pages with the meticulous care of someone who knows their exact worth. I thought the war was entirely over. I thought the revelation of the foreclosure was the final nail in the coffin of the Carter family drama. I thought they would retreat into their shame and leave me alone forever. I underestimated the desperation of a narcissist who has run out of victims. 3 months later, as the snow finally melted and the bleak, gray chill of March settled over Rhode Island, the phone call came. It was the ultimate, desperate play for control, a calculated manipulation so vile that it almost worked. They were about to weaponize death itself to force me back into the fold, and it would lead to the final, most brutal confrontation of my life. March in New England is a deeply deceptive month. The calendar claims that spring is arriving, but the reality is usually a landscape of gray skies, dirty, melting snowbanks, and a bitter, damp wind that sinks right into your bones. It had been exactly 3 months since the Christmas Eve dinner that shattered the Carter family. 3 months since I had walked out of the diner, leaving my father's $20 bill on the table. 3 months of absolute, glorious silence. I had settled into a beautiful rhythm. My business was flourishing. Liam and Harper were thriving in a household completely devoid of tension and passive-aggressive whispers. I was currently in the middle of a delicate restoration project, a 19th century atlas with a cracked spine and water-damaged maps. I was standing at my workbench, the smell of archival glue and old parchment surrounding me, the soft jazz playing from my vintage radio providing a steady, comforting heartbeat to the room. Then, the phone rang. It wasn't a cell phone call. It was the landline in my studio, a number I only gave to high-end clients and the children's school. I wiped the glue carefully from my hands with a damp cloth, walked over to the desk, and picked up the heavy receiver. "Kinsley Carter Restoration, how can I help you?" I answered, my tone professional and bright. "Is this Kinsley Carter?" a woman's voice asked. It was brisk, clinical, and underscored by the faint, echoing hum of a busy background. "This is Nurse Higgins calling from the emergency department at Cranston General Hospital." The air in my studio seemed to drop 10 degrees. I stood completely still, my eyes fixed on the half-repaired atlas on my desk. "Yes, this is she," I said, my voice dropping its professional cheer. "I'm calling regarding your father, Trevor Carter," she said efficiently. "He was brought in by ambulance about an hour ago. He suffered a stroke. Because you are still listed as his primary emergency contact in our system, protocol requires us to notify you." For a fraction of a second, the innate biological response of a daughter kicked in. My heart gave a hard, painful thump against my ribs. A stroke. The word carries a heavy, terrifying weight. It conjures images of devastation, of life-altering paralysis, of sudden, irreversible endings. Is he... I swallowed, forcing my throat to work. What is his condition? I braced myself for the worst. I braced myself for the nurse to tell me he was on life support or that he had slipped into a coma. "He is currently stable," Nurse Higgins replied, her tone softening just a fraction, likely accustomed to panicking relatives. "He suffered what we call a transient ischemic attack, a TIA. It's often called a mini stroke. While it is a serious medical event and a warning sign, the blockage was temporary. He is awake, alert, and his motor functions on his left side are already returning to normal. We are keeping him overnight in the step-down unit for observation and to run some imaging, but barring any complications, the attending physician expects to discharge him tomorrow afternoon with a referral for outpatient physical therapy." I let out a breath I didn't realize I was holding. A mini stroke. Survivable. Manageable. "Is my mother, Melissa Carter, at the hospital?" I asked. "Yes, his wife is here in the waiting area along with another younger woman." "Your sister, I assume?" "Yes," I said quietly. "Thank you for the update, Nurse Higgins. I appreciate you letting me know. You can remove me as his primary emergency contact moving forward. Please defer all medical decisions to his wife." I hung up the phone. I stood in the quiet of my studio processing the clinical reality of the situation. Trevor had suffered a health scare. It was a wake-up call, certainly, but it was not a death sentence. He was going to be fine. He was going to go home tomorrow. Before I could even turn back to my workbench, my cell phone sitting on the edge of the desk lit up. A text message from Bexley, the first communication from her since the diner. "Bexley, Dad had a massive stroke. He is in the ICU. The doctors don't know if he's going to make it through the night. Mom is collapsing. We need you here right now. Stop being a selfish bitch and get to Cranston General. Family comes first." I stared at the glowing screen. I read the words again. And then a cold, dark wave of absolute disgust washed over me. This was twist number 4, and it was, without a doubt, the most sociopathic move they had ever played. Melissa and Bexley were lying. They weren't just exaggerating, they were deliberately fabricating a life or death narrative. They were weaponizing a manageable medical event, turning a one-night observation stay into a deathbed vigil. Why? The answer hit me with the force of a physical blow. Money. It was always about the money. Thanks to Aunt Evelyn, I knew the truth about their financial ruin. Trevor and Melissa had no savings. I had wiped out my own accounts 5 years ago just to stop their house from being auctioned off by the bank. Their credit was likely non-existent. And Bexley? Bexley was currently living in a cramped apartment, her credit cards frozen by Harrison's forensic accountant, drowning in $40,000 of debt she couldn't pay. They were completely, utterly broke. And a man with a TIA still needs copays. He still needs prescription blood thinners. He still needs outpatient physical therapy, which, given Trevor's inflated ego, he would refuse to do at a public clinic, demanding private, expensive care instead. With Bexley's fraudulent gold mine shut down, they had lost their secondary income stream. They were staring down the barrel of actual, terrifying poverty, and I was the only person left with a functioning checkbook. But they knew they couldn't just call and ask. I had set a titanium boundary. I had blocked their access. So, they needed a skeleton key. They needed something so universally powerful, so socially mandated, that I would be forced to break my own boundaries and come rushing back to them. A dying father. It was the ultimate socially acceptable trap. If I ignored a dying man, I would be the villain not just to them, but to the entire extended family, to my children, to the world. They were using a medical emergency to stage a financial hostage situation. My phone buzzed again. This time, it was a call from Aunt Evelyn. I answered it immediately. "Kinsley," Evelyn said, her voice breathless and tight. "I just got off the phone with your mother. She is wailing like a banshee. She said Trevor is on life support and the doctors are asking about do not resuscitate orders. I'm packing an overnight bag. I'm going to drive down." "Aunt Evelyn, stop." I commanded, my voice slicing through her panic like a scalpel. Put the bag down. What? Kinsley, he's your father, regardless of what he's done. He had a TIA, Evelyn, I said, the coldness in my voice surprising even me. A mini stroke. I spoke directly to the charge nurse in the emergency department 5 minutes ago. He is awake. He is alert. He is being discharged tomorrow afternoon for outpatient rehab. He is not on life support. There is no DNR. The silence on the line was profound. I could hear Evelyn breathing, the gears turning in her sharp mind as she processed the magnitude of the lie. She lied to me, Evelyn whispered, the shock morphing rapidly into venomous anger. She is calling the entire family, Kinsley. She has Cousin Sarah setting up a meal train. She told Uncle David they might need help with funeral arrangements to prepare for the worst. My God, she's setting up a GoFundMe, isn't she? She's setting a trap, I corrected her. Bexley is cut off. Trevor has a minor medical bill coming. They need their ATM back, and they think a hospital bed is the one place I won't demand an apology. Don't you dare go down there, Kinsley, Evelyn said fiercely. Do not give them an inch. I have to go, I said softly, looking out the window at the gray March sky. Kinsley, no, it's an ambush. I know it is, I replied. But if I don't go, Melissa will spend the rest of her life telling the world that I abandoned a dying man. I am not going to let them control the narrative. I am going to walk into that hospital, I am going to look him in the eye, and I am going to make my choice in the daylight. And then I am going to shut this door forever. I hung up, washed my hands, and grabbed my coat. I didn't rush. I didn't speed down the highway. I drove to Cranston General Hospital with the calm, methodical precision of an executioner walking to the block. The hospital smelled exactly the way all hospitals smell. A sterile, terrifying mixture of industrial bleach, cafeteria soup, and underlying anxiety. I bypassed the main information desk, already knowing from the nurse that he was in the step-down unit on the 3rd floor. When I stepped off the elevator, I saw them immediately. Melissa and Bexley were sitting in the small waiting alcove outside the double doors of the unit. They had perfectly staged the scene of the grieving family. Melissa was clutching a crumpled tissue to her chest, her shoulders shaking with manufactured sobs. Bexley was sitting beside her, rubbing her back, looking appropriately disheveled and tragic. As I walked toward them, the heavy click of my boots on the linoleum echoing in the quiet hallway, Bexley looked up. Her eyes widened, and she immediately nudged Melissa. Melissa's head snapped up. When she saw me, her face contorted into a mask of overwhelming relief and sorrow. She stood up, reaching her arms out toward me as if she expected me to fall into them weeping. "Oh, Kinsley," Melissa cried, her voice echoing loudly in the corridor, ensuring any passing nurses could hear the reunion. "You came. Thank God you came. It's so bad, honey. He's fading. The doctors don't know what to do. The medical bills, we don't have the insurance for the kind of long-term care he's going to need. I don't know how we're going to survive this." And she reached out to grab my arms, her eyes darting to my designer handbag. The handbag she knew contained the credit cards she desperately needed. I stopped walking, staying just out of her reach. I looked at her, then looked at Bexley, who was watching me with a calculated, predatory stare. "You can stop the performance, Melissa," I said. My voice wasn't loud, but it was incredibly dense, dropping like a lead weight into the space between us. Melissa's hands froze in midair. Her manufactured tears instantly stopped flowing. "What are you talking about? Your father is—" "My father had a transient ischemic attack," I interrupted, my tone surgically precise. "He is awake, he has regained motor function, and he is scheduled for discharge tomorrow afternoon. I spoke to the charge nurse an hour ago. There is no life support. There is no long-term facility. The only thing fading in this hospital is your ability to manipulate me." Bexley stood up abruptly, her face flushing an ugly, mottled red. "You are such a cold, heartless bitch. He's in a hospital bed. He could have died. You think because you have a little money you can just abandon your family when they are suffering?" "You aren't suffering from a stroke, Bexley," I shot back, locking eyes with my sister. "You're suffering from the consequences of credit card fraud and a pending divorce. Do not use a hospital ward to try and extort me to pay your legal fees." Bexley's mouth snapped shut. The utter shock that I knew about her financial crimes paralyzed her. Melissa stepped forward, her mask slipping completely. The fragile, weeping mother vanished, replaced by the desperate, calculating enabler. "Kinsley, please," she hissed, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "We have nothing. The house is mortgaged to the hilt. We have no savings. If he needs private rehab, we can't afford it. You have so much. You owe us. We raised you." You raised a scapegoat, I corrected her quietly, and the scapegoat has left the pasture. I stepped around them and walked toward the heavy glass doors of the step-down unit. This is the part of the story where television shows always force a clean, emotional, moral lesson. This is the part where the abused daughter walks into the dimly lit hospital room, sees her cruel father looking small and frail in a hospital gown, and suddenly remembers his humanity. The machinery beeps softly. The father sheds a single tear of regret. The daughter holds his hand, they forgive each other, and the family is magically healed by the power of impending mortality. I need you to understand that real life does not work like that. Sickness does not cure narcissism. Frailty does not automatically create remorse. Sometimes it merely strips away the energy required to maintain the polite facade, leaving only the toxic core behind. I pushed open the door to room 312. Trevor was lying in the bed, the head raised to a 45-degree angle. He looked pale and gray, the skin around his eyes sagging. An IV was taped to the back of his hand, and a blood pressure cuff was wrapped around his bicep. He looked older than his years. He looked defeated. But then, he turned his head and saw me standing in the doorway. I watched his face closely, searching for any sign of softening, any sign of regret for the things he had said to me in the diner, any sign of shame for the 5 years he had spent punishing me for saving his home from foreclosure. There was nothing. His eyes hardened. The familiar, arrogant spark of superiority flared back to life. He didn't look like a man who was grateful his estranged daughter had come to check on him. He looked like a king who was annoyed his servant had taken so long to answer the bell. He lifted his right hand, the one unaffected by the TIA, and beckoned me forward. It wasn't a gesture of affection. It was a command. He pointed a thick finger at the floor beside his bed, indicating exactly where he expected me to stand, exactly how he expected me to submit. In that single, silent gesture, I saw the rest of my life if I walked into that room. I saw years of being berated while paying for his prescriptions. I saw Melissa draining my bank accounts while telling the church I was a terrible daughter. I saw my children, Liam and Harper, watching their mother be treated like a human ATM, learning that this was what love was supposed to look like. Fear of a medical consequence is not the same thing as regret for the harm you have caused. Trevor wasn't sorry. He was just inconvenienced by his own mortality, and he needed his wallet back to make the inconvenience disappear. I stood in the doorway for a long, agonizing minute. I let him see me clearly. I let him see the expensive coat, the calm posture, the absolute absence of fear in my eyes. I wanted him to know that I saw through the machinery, through the IVs, straight to the ugly, unchanged reality of his soul. I didn't say a single word. I didn't need to. I took one step backward out of the room. I reached for the heavy wooden door and maintaining eye contact with him until the very last second, I pulled the door shut until it clicked softly into the frame. I turned around. Melissa was standing a few feet away, her hands pressed over her mouth, her eyes wide with disbelief. She had seen me close the door. She knew exactly what it meant. "Kinsley!" she cried out, a raw, genuine sound of terror. It was the sound of a woman realizing her last lifeboat had just sailed away. "You can't leave. You can't just walk away from him. What are we going to do?" "You are going to reap exactly what you sowed, Melissa," I said, not slowing my pace as I walked past her toward the elevators. "Both of you. He's your father." Bexley screamed down the hallway, drawing the attention of 2 nurses at the station. "You're a monster. You're going to burn in hell for this." I pressed the button for the elevator. The door slid open immediately. I stepped inside, turned around, and looked at the 2 women standing in the sterile hospital corridor. Maybe the sacred rule in this family was always that Kinsley absorbs the abuse, Kinsley pays the bills, and Kinsley returns, I said, my voice carrying clearly across the distance. But I broke that rule, and I am never putting the pieces back together. The elevator doors slid shut, cutting off Melissa's wailing. I rode down to the lobby in silence. I walked out of the hospital, into the freezing March wind. I got into my car, locked the doors, and then, for the first time since Christmas Eve, I broke down. I didn't cry because I regretted my decision. I cried because making the right decision is sometimes accompanied by the most profound, agonizing grief. I cried for the father I deserved but never had. I cried for the mother who chose an illusion over her own child. I cried for the little girl inside me who had spent 34 years trying to buy the love of people who were fundamentally bankrupt. I sat in the hospital parking lot and wept until my chest ached and my eyes were swollen. I let every ounce of the poison drain out of my system. And then I wiped my face. I started the engine. I turned the heater on, feeling the warmth spread through the car. I put the car into drive and pulled out onto the highway, heading back toward Providence, heading back to my children, heading back to my sanctuary. I had made the cruelest choice society can imagine a daughter making. I had abandoned a sick father in a hospital bed. But as the hospital disappeared in my rearview mirror, I knew the truth. I hadn't abandoned him. I had finally rescued myself. And the Carter family's ultimate punishment was just waiting around the corner. In the months that followed that gray, bitter afternoon at Cranston General Hospital, my life did not fall apart. The sky did not cave in. The guilt that society practically guarantees will destroy a daughter who walks away from a sick father never materialized. Instead, my world settled into a new, beautiful shape. The silence that replaced the constant chaos of my family was deafening at first, but then it became a symphony. I stopped flinching every time my phone rang. I stopped checking my bank accounts with a knot of dread in my stomach, wondering which manufactured emergency I would be forced to fund next. I stopped playing the role of the heavily burdened, chaotic single mother that Trevor and Melissa had cast me in. Without the emotional vampire of the Carter family draining my energy, my career exploded. That summer, my studio was featured in a prestigious architectural and historical preservation magazine. I hired a part-time assistant to help with the influx of orders. I was flying to New York twice a month to consult on rare archives. I was finally living the life I had built, rather than hiding it to protect the fragile egos of people who despised me. But the most profound change was in my children. Kids are like sponges. They absorb the ambient anxiety of the adults around them. For years, Liam and Harper had lived in the shadow of my tension. But as spring turned into summer, and summer faded into a crisp, brilliant New England autumn, I watched my children blossom. Liam stopped biting his nails. Harper's night terrors disappeared completely. They stopped asking about Grandpa Trevor and Grandma Melissa. When adults stop making instability the climate of a home, children adapt to the peace with breathtaking speed. They knew, in their own intuitive way, that the monsters had been banished from the castle. As for the monsters themselves, I maintained my boundary of absolute steel. Trevor was discharged from the hospital exactly as the nurse had predicted. According to the grapevine, he demanded private, in-home physical therapy because he considered himself too important for a public rehabilitation clinic. But with my checkbook permanently closed and Bexley's credit cards frozen by Harrison's divorce lawyers, the Carters had finally hit a brick wall. I didn't reach out, I didn't check their social media. I moved on. But karma, as they say, has a perfect memory and an impeccable sense of timing. It was exactly 1 year later, December 24th. The anniversary of the dinner that had cracked my world open and let the light in. I was sitting in my studio by the window watching the heavy snow fall on the historic streets of Providence. Liam and Harper were upstairs in the living room listening to Christmas music and decorating gingerbread houses. The house smelled of cinnamon, pine, and the rich, comforting scent of antique leather from my workbench. It was a picture of absolute, unshakable tranquility. My phone buzzed on the desk. It was Aunt Evelyn. Evelyn and I had grown incredibly close over the past year. She had become the maternal figure I had always craved, sharp, honest, and fiercely protective. I picked up the phone, a genuine smile spreading across my face. "Merry Christmas Eve, Aunt Evelyn," I said warmly. "Are you still coming over for prime rib tomorrow?" "Wild horses couldn't drag me away from your cooking, Kinsley," Evelyn chuckled, her voice warm and raspy. "I've got the presents wrapped and 2 bottles of Cabernet ready to go. But I'm actually calling because I just had a rather illuminating conversation with Uncle David, and I thought you deserved to hear the ending of the story." I leaned back in my leather chair, taking a sip of my hot tea. "I'm listening." "You remember how I told you that Trevor had secretly remortgaged the house to the hilt before you bailed him out 5 years ago?" Evelyn asked. "Vividly," I replied. "Well, it turns out that wasn't the end of his financial genius," Evelyn said, her tone dripping with dark sarcasm. "When your money stopped flowing in January, Trevor and Melissa couldn't make the payments on that massive mortgage. They tried to take out another line of credit, but the banks practically laughed them out of the lobby. And with Trevor's new medical bills from the stroke," Evelyn paused, letting the weight of the moment hang in the air. "They lost the house, Kinsley, for real this time." I sat up straight, the tea pausing halfway to my mouth. "What?" "The bank foreclosed on them in October," Evelyn revealed, delivering the ultimate staggering twist number 5. "Trevor's pride and joy, the castle he used to look down on everyone else from, it's gone. They were evicted right before Thanksgiving." A wave of profound poetic justice washed over me. It wasn't malice. It was simply the universe balancing an incredibly toxic ledger. Trevor had spent his entire life projecting his financial failures onto me, humiliating me to cover up his own incompetence. And now, without his scapegoat to bleed dry, the illusion had completely collapsed. "Where are they living?" I asked, my voice hushed. That is the truly poetic part. Evelyn let out a dry, humorless laugh. Bexley's divorce from Harrison was finalized last month. Harrison got the house, the cars, and the remaining assets because Bexley's secret debt wiped out her half of the equity. She was left with absolutely nothing but a mountain of credit card bills and a terrible credit score. She couldn't afford her apartment anymore. "Don't tell me," I whispered. "Oh, yes," Evelyn confirmed. Trevor and Melissa had to move into a cheap, cramped 2-bedroom apartment on the wrong side of Cranston, and Bexley had to move in with them. The 3 of them are trapped in a tiny box together. I closed my eyes, visualizing the absolute hellscape of that apartment. Trevor, a raging narcissist stripped of his kingdom, his wealth, and his audience, confined to a cheap recliner. Melissa, a covert manipulator who no longer had any money to buy sympathy from her church friends, stuck playing nursemaid to a bitter husband. And Bexley, the fallen golden child stripped of her designer clothes and her wealthy husband, forced to live with the parents she secretly despised, drowning in debt she couldn't pay. They had nobody left to blame. They had nobody left to drain. The toxic loop they had created had finally closed in on them. They were going to spend the rest of their lives cannibalizing each other's misery. "Uncle David went to drop off a Christmas card yesterday," Evelyn continued softly. "He said the tension in that apartment is suffocating. Bexley screams at Melissa for ruining her life. Trevor screams at Bexley for being a failure. David said it looks exactly like what they deserve." "It is exactly what they deserve," I said quietly. "You survived them, Kinsley," Evelyn said, her voice thick with emotion. "You broke the cycle. You saved yourself, and you saved Liam and Harper." "I did," I smiled, a single happy tear slipping down my cheek. "I'll see you tomorrow, Aunt Evelyn. Drive safe in the snow." "Merry Christmas, Kinsley." I hung up the phone and looked out the window. The snow was falling thicker now, covering the streets in a pure, untouched blanket of white. I turned back to my workbench. Resting in the center was the 19th century atlas I had been repairing for months. The spine was completely rebuilt. The water-damaged maps had been painstakingly flattened, cleaned, and preserved. It was whole again. People often ask me how I fix things that seem so hopelessly broken. I tell them that restoration requires 2 things: an honest assessment of the damage and a gentle hand. You cannot fix a book if you pretend the pages aren't rotting. You have to cut away the dead, decayed material before you can bind the good parts back together. Families are the exact same way. Society tells us that blood is thicker than water. Society tells us that we must endure abuse, financial exploitation, and public humiliation in the name of family. We are told that setting a boundary is cruel and that walking away is a sin. But I am here to tell you that protecting your peace is not cruelty. It is courage. Choosing not to be a financial hostage to your parents' ego is not selfishness. It is self-respect. Refusing to let your children watch you be degraded is the highest form of motherly love. You do not owe anyone your sanity, your savings, or your soul just because you happen to share the same DNA. If you are listening to this right now and you are the Kinsley of your family, if you are the one quietly paying the bills, absorbing the insults, and playing the shock absorber for everyone else's dysfunction, I want you to know that you have the power to stop. You have the power to stand up from that table, put your coat on, and walk out the door. The collapse of their toxic system is not your responsibility. Some things in this life can be repaired if the binding is honest and the damage is named. But some things, like the Carter family, can only be walked away from, preserved in your memory strictly as evidence of what you were strong enough to survive. I chose my children. I chose my peace. I chose the version of myself that Liam and Harper deserve to learn from. And if Trevor Carter were to be wheeled into that diner today and he asked me if I would do it all over again, I would look him dead in the eye. I would leave $20 on the table and I would tell him, yes, every single time. Thank you so much for listening to this story. If Kinsley's journey of setting boundaries, breaking toxic cycles, and reclaiming her peace resonated with you, please hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications. We share powerful, real-life stories like this every week to help you remember that you are never alone in your struggles. Drop a comment below and let me know. What was the moment you finally realized you had to walk away from a toxic situation? Stay strong, protect your peace, and I will see you in the next video.